corazón sigue siendo tuyo, aunque no te tenga aquí. Algo sí te aseguro, que tú vives dentro de mí, que este amor es muy puro. No me dejes de querer, no me pongas en lo oscuro. Cuando me pongo a pensar en ti, concentrarme no lo consigo. Dicen que la distancia se lo olvidó. Cada segundo sin ti me atrapa la agonía. Por eso digo día a día que este amor no tiene fin. Dale, vamos, ahí nada más. Como en los cuentos de hadas, donde el amor es bonito, donde el amor nunca acaba. Como en los cuentos de hadas, te entregaría mi cielo, te daría mi alma, te daría mi alma. Cada instante que paso aquí te encuentro en cada pensamiento, cada palabra que compartí, conquistando tus sentimientos. Apartarme ahora de ti no me ha hecho quererte menos, por lo contrario te sigo queriendo. Mi alma se desnuda por ti, reclamando mis secretos, quedándome en silencio, acordándome de ti. Como en los cuentos mucho en mí. Estoy pensando en ti. Hoy me haces mucha falta. Quiero que estés aquí. Sin darte cuenta rompiste mi corazón. Creo que irte no fue la solución. Mientras me consumía con esta pasión, te ibas rumbo a un avión. Voy a aprovechar en esta canción para explicarte mi razón. Aunque lo nuestro no fue un error, no confiaba en el amor. Ahora que analizo mi pasado, no me había percatado de que yo me había enamorado. No sabes cuánto me ha afectado. No pensé en el momento, aprovechaste el tiempo. Nene, cuánto lo siento. Regresemos en el tiempo. Estoy pensando en ti, porque aunque tú lo niegues, sé que piensas mucho en mí. Estoy pensando en ti. Tú me haces mucha falta. Quiero que estés aquí. Estoy pensando en ti. Nena, has clavado una espina en mi pecho y todavía la tengo aquí. Estoy pensando en ti. Solo fue cuestión de miedo. Juro todavía siento tus besos, tu mirada junto a mí. Estoy pensando en ti. Trato de arrancarte de mi vida, sacarte, pero no puedo olvidarte. Baby. Yo quiero todo contigo, corazón, pero no lo consigo. Vuela conmigo. Yo quiero darte todo, mis sueños, mis tesoros. Corazón, pero no lo consigo. Déjame entrar en mi vida, que quiero estar contigo. Yo quiero todo contigo, corazón, pero no lo consigo. Vuela conmigo. Vuelvo junto a ti para hacerte feliz. Vuelvo junto a ti. Morena, donde hubo fuego, cenizas quedan. Para ti, Habana Sweet, la salsa que te quema. Quisiera girar el tiempo, reconquistar tus sentimientos. Quiero que tú me quieras para amarte la vida entera. Es que yo quiero que me quieras, ay, para amarte a mi manera. Quiero que tú me quieras para amarte la vida entera. Tú quieres ser mi novio y yo tu novia. En el libro del amor escribir nuestra historia. Aunque mi madre no quiera y mi padre se oponga, yo guardaré un lugarcito por siempre en mi memoria. Quiéreme como te quiero yo, ámame como te amo yo, para juntos vivir una linda ilusión. Quiéreme como te quiero yo, ámame como te amo yo, para juntos vivir una linda ilusión. sé que sueñas conmigo toditas las noches. No es pasión ni derroche, es el amor que tú sientes por mí. Oh, a veces miro hacia el cielo donde están las estrellas y tú eres la más bella, sin que me quede nada dentro de mí. No, quiéreme como te quiero yo. Ámame como te amo yo, para juntos vivir una linda ilusión. Oh, quiéreme como te quiero yo. Ámame como te amo yo, para juntos vivir una linda ilusión.
Buenos días, estamos probando el audio de la cabina de inglés. Probando el audio de la cabina de inglés. ¿Me escuchan?
Bueno, no sé, pero no va a hacer falta, pero bueno, para conocimiento. De momento tienes que hacer el español.
Esa forma extraña que usa para someter, al final se volverá en contra de sí. Bloqueando a los demás, te bloqueas a ti y sacas un boleto hacia la soledad. A pueblo que amanece con dignidad, cada día escucha se recruta.
Good morning, comrades. Every year, the permanent commissions of the National People's Power Assembly convenes in different territories some parliamentary hearings against the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed against our people by the government of the U.S. for 60 years now. The restrictions imposed by the pandemic advise to postpone these kind of activities because of the concentration of people it requires. So this morning, the Commissions of Foreign Relations, Health, Sport, and Constitutional Affairs, on behalf of all the other commissions present here, will convene the parliamentary hearing in favor of the lifting of the blockade, Cuba facing two pandemics. We are opening officially this cycle of the national capital, which, as you know, is the institutional headquarters of the offices of the National People's Power Assembly. This important event is being presided over by Deputy Esteban Lazo Hernandez, member of the Political Bureau of our party and Speaker of our National People's Power Assembly and the Council of State. We are also accompanied by the Vice President and the Secretary of the National Assembly and the Council of State, all the members of the Council of State, heroes of the Republic of Cuba, the Deputy Coordinating Chief of the Department of Foreign Relations of the Central Committee of our party, the President of the Cuban Institute of Friendship with the Peoples, directors of the party, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as other state bodies. Also present here, vice presidents, presidents, deputies, members of our permanent commissions, as well as representation of the committee of the party, the Young Communist Union, and the secretary of the Trade Union Bureau of our center. Comrades all. On June the 23rd this year, for the 28th time, the Cuba will submit to the consideration of the UN General Assembly the resolution entitled Necessity to Put an End to the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Blockade Imposed by the U.S. government against Cuba. Year after year, there has been an almost overwhelming support of the international community to our draft resolution. But the U.S. makes a mock about the international opinion. We intend to present our truths once again in this hearing, the causes of the main problems affecting us, the most of the hardships we suffer from, which day after day are overwhelming the Cuban people and hinder our development. Perhaps right now it is worthwhile remembering the questions asked by the first secretary of our party and president of the Republic of Cuba, Comrade Miguel Mario Díaz-Canel Bermúdez, during the closing speech of the 8th Congress of the party, when he said, and I quote, "It is said that Cuba is not a priority issue for the U.S. And as a sovereign nation, it would not need to be so. It would be worthwhile to question why are there specific legislations such as the Torricelli Act or the Helms-Burton Act, just to mention two examples, the purpose of which is to attack and try to control Cuba's destiny from the coercion against third parties intending to establish commercial or cooperation links. Why are the U.S. allocating hundreds of millions of dollars trying to subvert the constitutional order in Cuba? Why are they using so much time and resources trying to undermine the national awareness of Cubans? What is the justification for an economic, cruel, and unnecessary warfare for more than 60 years? Why are they paying for the price of an international isolation, evidence at the UN and other international fora, while maintaining a morally and legally unsustainable policy? End of quote. This morning, we will also listen to some of the numerous solidarity messages received from legislators and personalities from all over the world, which we very much appreciate. To open our hearing, I give the floor to Deputy José Luis Toledo Santander, President of the Commission of Constitutional and Juridical Affairs of our Parliament. Thank you very much. Good morning. Comrade Esteban Lazo Hernández, Speaker of the National People's Power Assembly and President of the Council of State. Comrade Deputies, Comrades all. With the triumph of the revolution and the proclamation of the first popular laws long awaited by our people, it is clear for the U.S. government what is the character of our revolution. If there were any doubts about the goals it pursued, these were cleared up when, on January the 1st, 1959, the first agrarian reform law was passed. This is a historical moment which was described as by the Army General Raul Castro as the crossing of the Rubicon, because as from that moment, the U.S. government was convinced that this was a true revolution breaking with the Washington patterns in the island, and that was setting an example in the world as an independent nation. While it was formally February the 7th, 1962, the formally recorded date marking the beginning of the economic blockade against Cuba, we have to recognize that as from 1959, there were also blockade measures being implemented by the U.S. government. Even when in March 1960, the Eisenhower administration approved the program of covert action against the Fidel Castro regime, the decision to overthrow the victorious revolution had been adopted since 1959. Two high officials from the State Department of the U.S., Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Livingston Marshall, and the Associate Secretary for Inter-American Affairs, Roy Rubelton, recognized that as from 1959, there had been a joint plan designed by the CIA to, and I quote, adjust all our actions in order to speed up the development of an opposition in Cuba, bringing about a change in the Cuban government resulting from a new government that would be favorable to the U.S. interests, end of quote. In 1960, the main American refineries established in Cuba expressed their decision not to send a single oil barrel to the country and banned the use of their refineries to process the crude oil sent from the USSR. In the face of that reality, on June the 10th of that year, Fidel said, "We are witnessing the first act of concrete attack and a plan to deprive the country from fuel." Added to that was the date of July 6, when Eisenhower took the decision to curtail Cuba's participation in the sugar market of the U.S., and some days later, it canceled the sugar quota, which was reduced to zero. On October 19th, this administration declared the partial embargo on trade, thus banning every export except for foodstuffs and medicines. And on January 3rd, 1961, the American administration broke diplomatic relations with Cuba. On the 16th, it established the first restrictions on travels of U.S. citizens to the island. These actions, as well as others that followed, attacking principal targets in our economic and social life, were contained in the very well-known memorandum written by Lester Mullery when it expressed, we have to very quickly implement all possible measures to weaken the economy by denying Cuba money and supplies with the purpose of bringing about hunger, desperation, and the overflowing of government. Consequently, the U.S. launched openly into this non-declared war, an aggression escalation, a genocidal policy with the implementation of the economic, commercial, and financial blockade against our country. As was expressed by the authors of the book, From Confrontation to the Attempts of Normalization, the U.S. Policy Towards Cuba, and I quote, thus, from the very years after the triumph of the revolution, the U.S. government pre-established the essential elements characterizing the U.S. policy towards Cuba up until the present. The subsequent U.S. administrations gave its own imprint to this policy, which means that present goals are just part of the same structure. Contemporary deployment of new instruments and the sophistication of a strategy that pursues always the same objective. Added to the horrible shadows of the blockade, there is a whole range of legislations, not only against Cuba, they are attacking third countries, vulnerating major principles of law and adequate international order and relations among states. By resorting to the extraterritorial implementation of these measures, which go against the legal order of the U.S. itself and the rights of U.S. citizens. In this painful history, the U.S. blockade against Cuba leaves a sequel of fatalities, damages, and scarcities. They happen to be the major obstacle to our government, to our development, and is the most serious and dangerous obstacle to a respectful and harmonious relation between our two states. But even despite that, the blockade, despite of the genocidal features characterizing it, has not succeeded in pursuing its goal, which is the overthrowing of the revolutionary government. It has resulted in a failed policy implemented by successive U.S. administrations, as recognized by the leaders of that nation. It has been repeatedly condemned by the international community. The economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the U.S. government against Cuba is the supreme expression of the transgression of international law. But in the face of that, there is day after day the firm willingness of a heroic people to defend with dignity its independence and sovereignty. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Toledo. Escucharemos ahora el testimonio de la senadora Beatriz Paredes.
Le saludo desde la República Mexicana. La República Mexicana
in which we admire and respect the heroic people of Cuba. Today, I'm a senator to the Republic, president of the International Affairs Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and I had the opportunity to be an ambassador of Mexico to your country in a period of time which was quite difficult for yourselves, in which I was able to ratify and be able to witness my conviction about the extraordinary strength of the people of Cuba in one of those moments of hardships of the special period. Today, that for an offense of the international law, the blockade to the Republic of Cuba still remains. Today, that the blockade is reinforced by the Helms-Burton Act is still in force, we would like to express the solidarity of the people of Mexico to ratify all the statements that the government of Mexico has made before the United Nations, rejecting the blockade, since this poses an instrument that constitutes a violation of human rights of many of our compatriots in Cuba, of yourselves, Cuban, and also of our Latin American and Caribbean compatriots, and this side of the Americas, which is Latin America. Receive from Mexico our solidarity, our respect, and our total denunciation against the existence of the blockade and our claim, so that once and for all, the blockade is eliminated. This blockade against the Republic of Cuba, and to eliminate the Helms-Burton Act. Thank you very much, Beatriz. The bonds that put together Mexico and Cuba are indestructible. We give the floor now to Raúl Palmero Fernández, legal advisor of Antillana de Acero.
Buenos días. Con permiso.
Good morning. I would like to ask your permission to be able to take the mask out of my face. My greetings to all the persons who are accompanying today and showing solidarity with Cuba from any place of the world. For more than 60 years, the United States has been taking Cuba under a commercial, economic, and financial blockade, which is genocidal, real, and is the main obstacle for the development of our country. Calling embargo this political and legal situation is an euphemism in concept and in language. However, this is a patrimonial kind of measure issued by the authorities with the purpose to assure an illegal action. These actions of the United States against Cuba do not contain a legal character. This stagnation do typify as a blockade and has been defined according to the London Navy Convention in 1909 as an action of war. This blockade is real, not only in the content, but also in the practical terms. Until March 1920, about $570 billion have been the reason of loss of this. The implementation of Helms-Burton and the financial sanctions are very well known, but our duty as Cuban is to take this impact to the international community, let them know what this genocidal act causes to the Cuban population. In facing the COVID-19, the blockade have been a struggle against two pandemics. They deny with this blockade the access to medications with more than 10% of American products, and also an impact in the mother and child attention, the attention to crucial patients, the assisted programs in health, and the program to control cancer in our country. There was a donation of lung ventilators as well as diagnostic kits and masks to face COVID sent by Alibaba, Chinese company that were not able to reach our country. The blockade have an important impact in those people who have some disabilities. Cuba is denied the possibility to acquire prostheses, and some other equipment which is used in giving medical care to these kind of persons. During the hemorrhagic dengue epidemic in Cuba, introduced with all intention by the U.S. government, that took the lives of 158 Cuban citizens and 101 underage persons, the sale to Cuba of the different devices were prohibited to Cuba. We had to buy them in some other faraway places, as well as the time to take to Cuba was quite difficult for us. A woman, a mother, said, when we came back from the airport, my child was vomiting, and he said, I'm just about to fall down. And then that was repeated during that day, and then we went to the hospital. She was hospitalized. I told her to sleep in the night, and she said, "No, Mom, I'm about to die." And before going to bed, she kissed me and said, "Hold my hand, Mom." In the morning, her hand was so weak, and when I looked at them, she was purple already, and then she died. 6 months after that, her father died because his heart could not resist. This is a testimony from Silvia Torres, a mother who lost her daughter. In another order of things, the United States sanctioned 27 companies, 54 vessels, and 3 individuals related to fuel area. None of them under the jurisdiction of the American laws, not even with the American citizenship, only with the purpose to avoid transportation of fuel to Cuba. There was a serious impact in the Cuban population. Between November and December 2019, it was not possible to plant 12,000 hectares of rice, as well as 30 tons of rice were not able to be harvested, as well as some other crops. We were not able to produce milk either, and some tons of sugarcane was also lost. This, of course, has an impact in the Cuban population. All educational levels had a negative impact for the lack of transportation for students and professors, as well as a change in the syllabus and educational programs. And we were able to witness the impact in the public transportation, and 75.8 million persons were not able to be transported compared to the year 2018. These measures also have an impact in the private sector. In the year 2019, the United States prohibited the entrance of American cruises and the flights to all the provinces except Havana, and this has a very considerable impact in small private business, in tourism. In all spheres of society, we have an impact. I work in the steel production sector with some steel bars, and the possibility to access the American market has been quite difficult for us since 2019 and 2020. We were able to export some tons of steel, but if we have been able to export that to the U.S. market, the incomes have been much more higher, having a positive impact in the Cuban population. This shows the genocidal character of these policies. According to the Rome Statutes, genocidal is any action led to destroy some populations. Blockade is included in this kind of definition. The sanction of genocide was approved by the UN General Assembly in 1948. As early as April 6, 1960, by a memorandum sent to the State Department by Lester Mallory, Deputy Secretary in the United States for Internal Affairs, he said, "Most Cubans support Castro. The only way to weaken the internal support is to create a difficult economic situation, and we have to use all necessary means to weaken the economic life in Cuba, to reduce financial resources, and to provoke starvation, desperation, and to defeat the government." And I unquote. Once these elements have been mentioned, it's important to say that to respond to the question that many people ask: why is the United States implementing this blockade against Cuba? They have the purpose to take back some properties that were taken away by the revolutionary measures after 1959. This has a legal basis? No, they don't, but these properties were nationalized according to the constitution that was enforced by that time, and they were state property applying the legislation in force. People from different nationalities were recognized. The payment back, the reimbursement for losing those properties in a pacific and legal process. So this is just a justification, as well as the reason they say that Cuba is violating human rights. Why do they so? The real thing is that they blockade Cuba because we in Cuba show an alternative system of social equity, which example, despite the economic limitation, is crashing. They cannot allow us to do that. They blockade us because they don't resist that they exist, because Cuba is showing that they defend the sovereignty of the people. If the system is so bad, as the imperialists say, why do they need to blockade this country? That's why Fidel, the historical leader of the Cuban Revolution, said in April 1961, what the imperialists cannot forgive us for is that we are here. They cannot forgive us for that we are here firm and brave and with the biological strength and the revolutionary spirit of the people of Cuba. We are here just in front of them, and we have developed a socialist revolution, and I unquote. This is all I wanted to convey here, Mr. President, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Palmero. Elocuente.
Thank you very much, Palmero. This is a very good example, and we would like to listen now to the representatives of the Parliament from Europe, the Vice President of the European Parliament, Rapadi Morios, and Javier Moreno, who is the President of the Parliamentary Informal Group of Friendship with Cuba.
19, η κυβέρνηση Τραμπ ενίσχυσε τις ίδια.
In an attempt to suffocate the Cuban economy. Therefore, it reverted the positive steps that Obama's administration had taken on April 2015 with the gradual flexibilization of sanctions. These measures reduce even more the potential of development of the country in a humane level for the Cuban people. This suffocating U.S. embargo imposed since 1960, over 60 years, is an absurd and inhumane practice, condemned every year during decades, almost by unanimous support at the UNGA. During the previous period, Biden promised to change this. This should be an immediate priority for the new President of the United States, because every day there are serious economic consequences and humanitarian consequences, especially in this period of pandemic. This should be done right now. Our purpose should be to build bridges of dialogue at all levels, at the civil society, at the parliamentary level, and transnational level. I believe that with mutual respect and cooperation, we will achieve more. I would like to convey all Cuban brothers and sisters, all MPs of the National Assembly, warm greetings on behalf of the European Parliament Friendship Group with the Cuban people. This group will always support you. We will be always with you. This is another year in which we will support the resolution to be presented at the UNGA, where unfortunately we have to condemn once again the U.S. financial blockade imposed by the United States and to call for lifting of the blockade. And after this deadly time during Trump administrations, we take back the path set by Obama, and this is retaken by Biden's administration. With this world pandemic, the Cuban people have suffered even more. You should have no doubt on Cuba's contribution to the world. For example, the medical brigades deployed during the pandemic throughout the world, and particularly in Italy. And we have proposed from this House to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. I really hope that they win it because they deserve it. Thank you very much. both of you, but these sincere expressions of solidarity. I give the floor to Johanna Odriozola, Deputy Minister of Economy and Planning.
El bloqueo.
The economic, financial, and commercial blockade imposed by the United States against Cuba remains the main obstacle for the development of Cuba. As it has been said before, since April 2019 until March 2020, the effects of the blockade have exceeded the threshold of $5 billion. And this year, it amounted to $3 billion. The blockade it entails not only these effects, but some other sanctions that involve institutions, companies, financial and banking institutions in their operations with Cuba. In 2019, only one day, 3 European financial companies were sanctioned for $1.3 billion. Sanctions to these kinds of institutions in 1 year are over $2 billion. The blockade is a legal scaffolding, and it has a top expression with the Torricelli Act 1992 and the Helms-Burton Act in 1996. Which contains the main measures implemented so far. The Helms-Burton Act has been questioned not only from the political point of view, but also from the legal point of view, since it constitutes a violation of international law. Very few countries have not expressed their opposition against it. Strict condemnations according to international law have been expressed because the courts of a country are not entitled to sanction citizens or companies from other countries because of actions effected in a third country. As you know, the Helms-Burton Act has several titles that show the extraterritorial effects. The first title is called Strengthening of the International Sanctions Against the Government, and under this title there are several sections banning the granting of financing to Cuba, the prohibition to Cuba to be member of international organizations, and some other provisions and measures that somehow affect and put pressure on those citizens, people and companies who are interested in investing in Cuba or cooperating with our country and the Cuban people. This legal system in violation of international law, Title III, as it is known, it was discontinued by the following administration until 2019, has been rejected unanimously in the international arena because it's contrary to international law. The implementation of Title III as of 2019 has led to more than 3 lawsuits in U.S. courts and Cuban against Cuba and against European institutions. The importance of this entitlement is to put pressure. The goal is to put pressure on foreign investors trying to harm these kind of relations with Cuba. No citizen or sector in the Cuban economy is alien to the impacts of the blockade. the whole state sector, whatever their activities are, including the private sector, have been affected by the tightening in the last years of the several measures undertaken under Trump administration. For example, it has specific effects for international trade. The exports of products and services of our economy have not been done because of the blockade depriving us from these sources of income. The tourist activity is over $1.8 billion. So the income received by traditional activities are being affected, and the U.S. Market could be a destination for these products, but this is not limited to the exports we have done, but it also affects the imports made by Cuba, since we cannot favor from this nearby market. We have to go to other distant markets, which entail to have shipments due to the sanctions imposed against the vessels docking in Cuba. It also affects the technological activity. In a year that the world has been facing an unprecedented pandemic, we haven't been able to access specific technologies that belong to this country and that help to prevent and face this pandemic. I could state many examples. The impacts are very serious in the banking and financial system, precisely because of the sanctions imposed. In 1 year, 137 banks refused to do operations with Cuba, and this leads to effects of 280 million transactions that are being stopped, more documents that are being demanded, expensive costs because of the country risk that are related with us. And these financial institutions are fearful of being subject to these sanctions. Therefore, the blockade is real. It has a huge impact on our economy, on our people, and even the economy of that country and some other companies or people interested in having links economically and financially. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, dear MP. Now, from sister nation South Africa, we have the floor to Honorable Solomon Lechesa Sinoli, Deputy Speaker of their Parliament. Nuestra mayor
is the Biden administration not proceeding with what we thought were very hopeful signs of reversing historic sanctions and a blockade on Cuba. That constituted disappointment. And the reason is he supported the anti-apartheid struggle in his younger days as a congressman in the United States. Now that he has the possibility to help continue that campaign, which was a crucial part of the work we were calling for, that sanctions and the blockade on Cuba stifles the possibility for it to satisfy the needs of its own country, but the needs of others elsewhere in the world who learn and benefit from the expertise that a socialist path provides to the world. So we are in the language of the president of our country, we agree with him fully as the Communist Party that we are resolute in condemning the continuation of the sanctions and the blockade. We are resolute in calling, for example, for the release into Cuba's hands of Guantanamo Bay.
Muchas gracias por su mensaje de apoyo.
Thank you very much for your support message, brotherhood, which is a symbol of the ties uniting us. Now I give the floor to Carlos Fernandez de Cosillo, Director of U.S. Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who has been specially invited to our hearing.
Comrade President Esteban Lasso, Comrade Ana María Machado Homero, Secretary, comrades all. Good morning. I'll be taking the floor in this occasion to tackle the historical pretexts or reasons, or justifications that the U.S. administration have used for years to implement the economic blockade, this economic war against our country in the last 62 years. And I'm going to mention here as well the features and the sense and the meaning of the main measures applied to reinforce, to strengthen the blockade implemented during the Trump's administration, which are still in force. The first justifications used by the U.S. administration, which were used as well for many decades to be able to justify the blockade and to give a reason to the international community, which were many, and include the reason that with the Cuban Revolution, there was an introduction in the Western Hemisphere of an ideology which was alien or different from Pan-Americanism, which was the one acceptable for the U.S. in our hemisphere, and there was the imperialist domination system in which what we call the Americas. This is one of the reasons they posed. One of the other reasons, which was very close to this one, was the relations we had with the prior Soviet Union, with China, and with the socialist bloc of countries, which for the United States was totally unacceptable. After the decades of the 1970s and the 1980s, one of the public reasons to explain, to justify the blockade was our internationalist position and the solidarity we showed with the African peoples, particularly our support to liberation movements, and specifically to Angola. And also, one of the reasons during the decades of the 1980s was the need to force us to stop showing solidarity with the revolutionary and national liberation movement in Central America. Those were the justification, the particular justifications used by the U.S. administration. However, we know that the most honest explanation, the sincere explanation, was kept away or hidden for years. And that is the one appearing in Lester Mallory's memorandum, which was in the morning mentioned by Palmero and Toledo, which was drafted by April 1960. And I'm not going to quote this document because already was quoted by the previous speakers. In that certain period, and in a non-public and a private way, after many years, it was public, but in that moment, the President of the United States, Eisenhower, recognized or acknowledged the real purpose, and his phrase was, if they are suffering starvation, Castro will be taken away from power, from office. So the main purpose was to provoke, to create starvation in our population. But up to 1992, when, for the first time in the UN General Assembly, the project, which is every year the motion claiming for the end of the blockade of the United States towards Cuba, only at that time the U.S. delegation, for the first time, mentioned the attempt to justify the blockade as a response to the nationalization process which was legally performed in our country. This is a justification that up to that specific point had not been mentioned, and only at the beginning of the 1990s, as I said, in the General Assembly was for the first time approved or passed this resolution that claims for the lifting of the blockade. This, I have an explanation. By that time, the Soviet Union had disappeared. The socialist bloc in Europe had disappeared, and that was a reason that was not to be used anymore. By that period of time, we had already met our internationalist commitments with Africa, safeguarding the integrity and the national security of Angola. We had been able to work in the claim of the liberation of Namibia, and we have been making some steps to put an end to apartheid in South Africa. That's why that was a reason they were not able to use anymore. And during the 1990s, there were not liberation movements or new liberation movements in Central America. Sure, after that, in 1996, the Helms-Burton Act was passed, was approved, and if you see track 1, there are some reasons, a long number of reasons were listed on explaining why this act was implemented. The ones that were more emphasized in that drafting were, one, to promote human rights, which is a total shameful because it's totally shameful because the role of the United States is very well known as an aggressor of the human rights in the domestic issues and in supporting the brutal regimes that have been existent at least in the post-war period in the world. In this act, they also state that one of the reasons they implement the blockade is because Cuba is practicing illegal trade of narcotic substances. That say also that Cuba uses torture against prisoners. They say as well that Cuba is a threat for peace and international peace and security, and that Cuba is particularly a threat to the national security of the United States. And in this same act, they state that Cuba illegally confiscated properties from American owners in Cuba. They are referring to legal nationalizations that took place in the revolutionary period in Cuba. Then some other reasons have been appearing, and the Trump administration, the one before Biden administration, used some reasons to apply hostile measures, mainly after 2017. All those reasons are known by our population. They say that Cuba have had or still have more thousands of troops, military troops in Venezuela. The president of Brazil was so exaggerating these figures, saying that millions of troops were in some other countries. Cuban troops were in other countries. They also said during this period that Cuba is an evil influence in the Western Hemisphere. They also used the justification that from this country, American diplomatic staff were attacked in the U.S. embassy in Cuba. They do not use the word attack anymore, but that was one of the reasons they used, or justifications they used, to apply these measures against our country. And they also, to boot, have said that Cuba have been applying trafficking of people. they apply that, and they say also that compatriots, Cuban compatriots, our daughters, have been present in many countries, and they say that this is a way that in which we implement trafficking in persons. During Donald Trump's administration, they used the reasons I already mentioned to justify the existence of the blockade. But all the real reasons that exist are very old practices, as old it is the origin of both nations, and they are used by powerful political groups which are not accepting the real right of sovereignty, independence, and self-determination in Cuba. They are not able to accept our future and our determination to achieve social justice, and they have the whim to destroy the Cuban example and to avoid that our socialist model, our anti-imperialist model might be successful. Those are the real purposes of the blockade. That is the real reason for these aggressions against Cuba. For that, they need to try to put down our economic development and our economic endeavors. They need to stop our financing sources. They need to sabotage our foreign trade and to stop our access to technologies. They trying our population to suffer from scarcity and economic problems and to destroy the services that our population depend on. The real reasons are contained in the Helms-Burton Act, but not mentioned as such. A very detailed analysis of this act, mainly track 1 and 2, to force the U.S. administration to punish Cuba, to try to force third country governments to punish Cuba, and an act that defines how the Cuban government might be defeated, how to establish a government designed by the United States, following the example and the image of the United States and controlled by the United States, is a more sincere description of which are the real purposes of the United States administrations towards our country. The rest, the other justifications are just that, justifications. Trump's administration applied against Cuba what we call a maximum pressure policy, with a number of sanctions, unprecedented actions, which were systematic and constant, and every week we were under new sanctions by Trump's administration. We know that the Secretary of State, Pompeo, by that time, confessed to American diplomatic personnel that the purpose of this high-pressure policy was to create starvation in Cuba that might defeat the government, as clear as that, to provoke the starvation that lead the country, the population, to defeat the government. These are the real reasons of the more than 240 sanctions that were implemented during Trump's administration, and that today, I mean, Trump is not in office anymore since January, but still those sanctions are in force. Today, those sanctions are part of the current administration in the United States. These measures try to constitute an obstacle or try to create obstacles for the development of the country, were surgically analyzed to avoid the development of the country. Johanna Tablada explained the economic impact of this policy, and the sectors that were impacted by these sanctions. They were trying to avoid foreign investment in Cuba, and it's well known that all developing countries need foreign capital for its development, and is a legal issue that our country has as a policy, economic policies to attract foreign capital in the country. When the U.S. stops applying the prerogative of the president not to use actions in the courts of the United States to implement lawsuits, it's to avoid that Cuba might have the possibility to attract foreign capital. Travels to Cuba was also impacted. The tourist industry, which is one of the main sectors of development and important source of incomes, was also sabotaged, and some measures were adopted during those years to stop it, since travel alerts on the justifications that American diplomatic personnel was attacked in Cuba, as well as the prohibition of cruise ships to Cuba, as well as the suspension of licenses in different categories that were granted during Obama's times to travel to Cuba, the modification of the licenses that existed so far, as well as the issuing of some prohibition for people to stay in Cuba. So the American citizens or people under jurisdiction of the United States to stay in Cuba, either private or state-owned houses or institutions. There are some private houses in which American citizens or people living in the United States were not allowed to stay. And they also canceled many of the flights, either the number of flights or the destinations that might exist between the United States and Cuba. Likewise, remittances were changed, establishing some specific amounts to legal state-owned entities, which in Cuba regulate the border transfer of some money. I'm talking about remittances. That was one of the main targets they selected. They took also some, or implemented some sanctions against the bank institutions in Cuba to stop the transfer of finances towards Cuba, not only bad things about Cuba, but also because this is a legal way of incomes in our country. And also they spoke negatively about the professionals trying to work in these transfers. They restricted licenses and denied licenses to some of the business that existed in Cuba just to create a negative input in that important sector of economy, and they strengthened the financial persecution towards our country. I don't know if it is very well known that the foreign service in Cuba has great difficulties in many capitals of the country only for the embassies overseas. Our embassies overseas might function having legal, common, normal bank and financial actions and exchange in those countries. And this is a way to see the extraterritorial effect of the American blockade, even under the jurisdiction of other countries in a globalized world in which we live. And among the measures that have been implemented are those of depriving Cuba of fuel supplies. This is an escalade, qualitative, have a significant escalade, and those are measures which are non-conventional in war times, but for war times, but implemented in peace times. And we know the difficulties that these pose for Cuba for attaining fuel for the functioning, normal function of a country, of a common society, and in this specific case about Cuba. And by January this year, they included Cuba in the list of countries that sponsor and support terrorism, which is a total lie against our country, something we referred to in a declaration, a statement of a Ministry of Foreign Affairs 2 days ago. This is a lie against Cuba, and this is an action that have practical impact affecting the financial sector particularly, and that in many countries of the world it's difficult for us to pay for the products we are attaining, for the services we request, or to be paid for the goods we sell, or to ask for credits and loans. And this is difficult because the United States included us in this illegal and fallacious list of countries. The blockade is a weapon, is led to submit the Cuban nation. This has been applied even before the economic blockade was declared. It means they have been punishing different generations of Cuban in daily life and in solving the fundamental problems of the countries. And the main purpose of this has not been achieved because of the strength of our society, because of the nature of our revolution, because we have a socialist system and we have defended, even considering all sacrifices. That is why the blockade have been able to defeat the revolution. But history shows the main justifications and the real reasons for its application. It shows that there are no concessions made by Cuba, there are no steps made of Cuba that lead the United States to change this blockade position, because the purposes are closely linked to the imperialist nature of the U.S. political system, the determination of the Cuban nation to defend and build a sovereign, really free society practicing self-determination. The history of blockade and all the justifications used shows as well the lie is a resource. It's a valuable resource and a present resource, either in design or implementation of measures of the United States, and they have been using so fallacious devices or resources to apply this genocidal policy, which has failed in its main purpose but have been successful in posing difficulties and damages and been an obstacle for the development of the economy in Cuba and for the development of our country. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, compañero Cosío. Y a continuación.
And now we will listen to two messages. One from ex-congressman by Virginia, James Moran, and a message from Vijay Prashad, director of the Tricontinental Study.
Cuba is a gem, economically, socially, and as an opportunity for Americans to enjoy themselves visiting Cuba. We are neighbors. We ought to work together as neighbors. We have disagreements in terms of the way that our governments operate, but bear in mind there's a lot of history. At one point, the organized crime members largely ran the island of Cuba and exploited it. And a relatively small number of people benefited from the resources that Cuba had to offer. And a large number of people, the vast majority, were exploited, were treated badly, particularly the darker-skinned Cubans. So now everyone gets an education. Everyone gets superb health care. I'm not arguing for socialism, let alone communism. I'm arguing for the United States to spend time visiting Cuba, get rid of those stupid sanctions. The United States has nothing to fear from Cuba. and a whole lot to gain. So let's open up our hearts and our borders and make friends with our neighbors. It's in our interests, and I know we won't regret having done so.
Yes, I'm against the illegal blockade of Cuba. Yes, the United States must lift its heavy boot off the neck of the Cuban people and allow Cuba to exercise its rightful sovereignty. Which sensitive person is going to say the blockade must continue? Not the member states of the United Nations, which vote each year to send a message to the United States government to dismantle the blockade. Not the majority of the world's peoples who know that Cuba exports doctors and not bombs, that Cuba does not impose war on the world, but only wants peace and wants to advance the agenda of the UN Charter. Everyone knows that. Even the people of the United States who want the blockade to end. No one wants this blockade to continue, and yet it does. The United States does not fear Cuba as a country. The United States was happy enough with Cuba from 1898 to 1959, during the period when Cuba's oligarchy subordinated itself to the interests of the United States. Cuba is not the problem. The problem for the United States is the Cuban Revolution. The United States government, on behalf of the governments of the other powerful capitalist states, would like not to destroy Cuba itself, but to destroy the Cuban Revolution. The global oligarchy knows it has no answers to the problems that grip the world. The Cuban Revolution and its socialist experiment have some answers. The US government wants to destroy the Cuban Revolution. Yes, the blockade must end, but more, the Cuban Revolution must be defended. Venceremos.
Sí, sin lugar a dudas.
Yes, we shall overcome in this struggle. Thank you very much, distinguished gentlemen. You have expressed a feeling of great majority of the U.S. people and also members of the U.S. Congress who support the desire to live at peace and develop bilateral relations based on good neighborhood and without any interference of any kind. Now let's listen to two other friends of the Cuban people. MP François Lambert, chairman of the Parliamentary Friendship Group France-Cuba, and the Italian Senator Paola Lunis, and Congressman Robert Fico from Slovakia. As president of France-Cuba Friendship Group, dear MPs, let's write to the President of the United States and the President of France and ask for the end of the blockade against Cuba, because the blockade prevents Cuba to live normally and to achieve its development in agriculture, in industries, and whatever is needed to live a normal life. Let's write, and we call for the immediate end of the blockade. See you. Bueno, good morning, everyone. We are very happy that we are part of this call so the blockade is eliminated. With the approval of the blockade, it is unthinkable that after 60 years and in the midst of this pandemic, that still this capitalism is imposing limits to the development of Cuba. We have seen that in this pandemic, and these sanitary emergencies, that the Cuban solidarity and its sciences have contributed to the human values and has helped many in the world. This is a moment that we recognize the value, the humanity and solidarity.
Dear Cuban friends, greetings and best wishes from Slovakia. Unfortunately, there are still states and politicians that only wish for the worst for other nations. It is reprehensible that someone would choose Cuba as the target of their hatred. Cuba has not harmed anyone. It does not threaten anyone. It lives its life with its joys and worries. Cuba bothers the United States only because it exists and resists. Dear friends in Cuba, you have my full support in a just, long-lasting rejection of the foolish US sanctions policy. Sanctions can and do hurt, but they will not solve anything. In particular, they cannot change the determination of the free country to go its own way. The only result of the senseless American sanctions policy is an increase in sympathy for Cuba and a deepening of dissatisfaction with your northern neighbor. If the United States wanted to achieve this, they were extremely successful. Lastly, in addition to greetings and support from Slovakia, I'd like to express my admiration and gratitude for the thousands of Cuban health professionals who have helped and are helping to fight COVID around the world. There can be no better answer to these sanctions. Dovidenia, priatelia.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, esteemed friends of the Cuban people, for the support to our people and for your warm words. I have spent my whole life saying that I'm afraid of vaccines. I've spent my whole life childhood crying when vaccines came on the scene. I've spent my long infancy fearing whenever vaccines time came. And now it has just turned out that I long for one of them. Here's my arm. It's just a prick. Creepy, crawly, you are a waste. Shame on you. You are a disgrace. Do you know how to play baseball? Then listen and heed my call. The vaccine, if you don't know it, it's a bat walking the ball. And the corona keeps going, and it's gone. What a wonderful home run.
Muchas gracias a este colectivo de niños.
Thank you very much to this group of children gathered under La Colmenita theater group, giving us happiness and confidence in the future of our homeland. Let us listen now to a young scientist representing those who have made it possible for us to design our candidate vaccines thanks to their dedicated and determined work, who work day and night to ensure the health and well-being of our people. I invite now to the podium Deputy Dr. Yuri Valdez Balbin, Associate Director of the Finlay Institute. If you allow me, I will remove my mask. Members of the chair, friends, first of all, I will start by thanking the motto presiding over this meeting, Cuba facing two pandemics. This is a very intelligent phrase. Those of us engaged in the struggle against the pandemic could not say it better. I will try to discuss about our experiences. I have come from the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry in Cuba. The first thing that we should understand that our industry is devoted to research, develop, manufacture, and market pharmaceuticals, vaccines, biotech products, medical equipment, most of them for human health. We listen to the pretext resorted to by those who wanted to starve us, but this is not about food. This is about the health of the people. This is about a person being in a hospital where the difference between life and death could be made by one pharmaceutical, and due to certain circumstances, we may not have access to them. So at the end of the day, we should think that there isn't any valid pretext. This is about a warfare. And the other element is that one hears a lot of people saying that we are blockading the government of Cuba. No, no. When you realize that medication is a concrete need of any citizen, no matter their ideological position, then you realize and ask yourself, well, is that so that the government is the one that is being affected? Well, the second idea is that the blockade didn't start with the pandemic. We all know that. The thing is that in the context of the pandemic, it has been further tightened, but this is an industry in which we work. Since the very beginning, it was created under the circumstances of the blockade, and at all times, in every juncture, we have been able to coexist with and face these blockade actions. The pandemic, and I usually make this reflection, started 18 months ago. I mean, it has been under 2 U.S. administrations. It started with one administration and continued under a different administration. The pandemic has created an international context in which there are very distinctive 3 features. This is a universal tragedy. None of those who had implemented the blockade ever heard about a health tragedy before, because this is a universal tragedy. Second, this tragedy brings about a lack of supply at the universal level. At some point, we spoke about survival, and I believe that we are still speaking about human survival, looking at the way in which the world trends move. And these features converge as from December 2019, and I would like to underline that. There is a question, underlying question, how come Cuba has reached on December 2019 to the possibility to respond to that problem? Because obviously in the face of that situation, every single country must give a response with whatever resources are available, because we are all facing the same problem. Obviously, needless to say, there has been a solidarity on the part of the government, but when it comes to the response to that juncture, the question is this: how come Cuba has the capability to respond to that pandemic? First, because we have the human resources. Any country not having the human resources capable to respond to that. We are speaking about health system, the health staff, researchers, the people, the government. We have a human potential. Most of them was born and has been living under the blockade. Second, we have technological capabilities and products, because we should remember that this has been a context whereby we have all been forced to learn. There's something going on that has to do with the life of all, but very little is known about this. We are all studying and work, but we must be learning from each other on the way. We must have products to make an impact, but also the manufacturing capabilities. And we shouldn't forget that we have a system of management at the level of the country that is based on the Constitution of our republic. The Constitution of our republic, adopted recently, endorses the role of science, innovation, and health, and the government to respond to situations like this. So being able to articulate our work based on the supreme document of our homeland means that this is a distinctive feature giving us the possibility to respond to a tightened blockade. That is very important. The result that we are having is a result of the strength of a country as the zone goes. We have had to do that under very difficult circumstances. We have, for many years, worked in this area. The biggest number of persons who have been intensively working under these circumstances have two main features. First, there is a great percentage of young people, a high percentage of young people, and a high percentage of women. I'm saying this not in the spirit of boasting about this. I say it because that capability to face this problem was mainly thanks to the young people and the women very much affected by the blockade. This is difficult to quantify. What is the subjective impact on a condition making a young girl with 2 children is forced to go out and work for 16, 18 hours on a daily basis under very difficult conditions without having an adequate support and under the pressure of the blockade. We are also aware of the fact that the blockade, in our opinion, is not about 3 persons deciding upon something. We do believe that this is a very intelligent policy. We perceive it is an intelligent, although damaging policy built and intended to suffocate a country. There are 3 elements we will very quickly exemplify. First, we must understand that the industry behind the products is a high standards industry. Not everybody, not every country have raw materials that can supply you with the materials necessary to manufacture a preventive vaccine that is going to be applied to healthy persons to avoid diseases. And this must be done following high standards, which is very much centralized by transnationals and providers. There is an access under the blockade which is feverishly pursuing an impact on providers. They do not sell to you these products. I am going to read the message sent by one important provider from the biotech industry field, and it reads, first, we must understand this figure. 51% of Cuban providers are intermediaries because we cannot buy from factories directly because of the blockade. Intermediaries are trying to also to avoid the blockade, and they live on that kind of business. So 51% of all our providers are intermediaries. But I will read this message we received through an email. There are several ones, but I will read this one. March 4th, 2020, in the midst of the pandemic. March 4th, 2020, we knew in Cuba that the solution was a vaccine. We knew that we had to import all the necessary resources under the universal conditions to produce that vaccine. And it reads, unfortunately, we must inform you that the tightening of the blockade by the U.S. government is forcing our company to make a close investigation on all the products that we supply to Cuba to decide whether or no they contain part of the U.S. Manufactured components. We are aware that this situation can lead to bottlenecks in terms of our supplies to Cuba, and we apologize for this inconvenience. And this was written in March 2020 in the context of the pandemic. These have been written by a critical provider of the system that could have benefits for the for the Cuban health system. And this is another message. The provider informs that cephalexin has increased its value by more than 30% as compared to former years. This is the context in which we are working these two modalities. I cannot provide you with the materials, but in addition to that, I am increasing the products that you need. This creates difficulties for us. This is very difficult to quantify. Another element here, which has been discussed here, has to do with the problem with banks. In order to make a payment or a financial transaction today is extremely complex. You have the money. We are not saying that you are looking for a provider. Even if you have the money, even if you want to pay, this becomes difficult. There are thousands of examples of these difficulties. I will not take long in reading it, but this is something conventional. We receive these on a weekly basis. I do not accept this banking switch because the products belong to an American company. This is not an American bank. This is not a bank based in the U.S. This is not a bank based on a blockaded third world country. This bank is saying, I am not accepting your banking SWIFT payment. This is part of our daily work. And there is a one-third element, which is the access to a certain financing, which have to do with the development of our industry. So if you combine all these three elements, you would realize that this is a policy that is not intended only to bring about hunger. It is intended to cause harm. So in our opinion, we are faced with a war. It is intended to affect the quality of living of Cubans because it affects treatment. It affects the life of our people. It is true that it also affects incomes because it is intended that once you make exports, you make an export and there is no bank able to pay to you. And there's also a problem with the access to financing. I will end by saying that very hardly you will find any pretext justifying these. The other day we were listening to an information stating that the U.S. government didn't identify as a priority the review of their relations with Cuba. We have to challenge the U.S. government and tell it that if perhaps they do not have enough time to review the U.S.-Cuba policy, this policy that has to do with hospitalized Cubans, with vaccinated Cubans, and we must say that we have not been able to vaccinate more Cubans because we do not have enough resources to manufacture more vaccines. We have not had enough resources to manufacture the vaccines, to really produce vaccines enough for all Cubans. And we must challenge the U.S. government and say, okay, you may not review all of it, but just review that piece of policy. You can make the difference between people who die and people who survive. We, as a scientific center, feel pain about the fatalities that we have because we know what's the difference between life and death. And when this happens, because there is someone not taking the decision of allowing us that through our all efforts to do better, it is true that they do not want us to become an example, but they are being accomplices of the life and death of many Cubans, and we must say that. Let them review that. Let them stop the war on providers. The only thing we want to do is to manufacture our own vaccines. There is nothing that can justify the end of a life of a person or taking a smile from a child's face. We shall overcome.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Dr. Valdez Balbin, for your valuable testimony and for the work you're doing. Please convey to the scientific Cuban community this appreciation and our considerations who are putting into practice of Fidel Castro's thoughts. Now we would like to give the floor to John Kirk, professor of Dalhousie University. This is a position of my government toward the position of the Cuban Revolution. For decades, Washington have curbed a ferocious policy against the revolutionary process in Cuba, has taken high cuts, thousands of billion dollars that have been witnessing the people of Cuba as a result of a blockade, $130,000 billion. You might imagine how life in Cuba has been without this aggressiveness, without they have been plundered and taken away this amount of money and causing so much suffering. Cuba, for instance, wouldn't be paying these high prices for imports through third countries because the United States are blockading this country, or purchasing some medical devices that cannot be imported because it contains more than 10% of the devices built in the United States. That's total cruelty. And this all in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, and also because of the need of stopping tourism, and because of the position of Trump's administration applying these more than 240 sanctions, including a suspension of remittances and travels from the States to Cuba, to deprive Cuba from incomes and asphyxiate its economy. The whole world, with the exception of Israel, a country that totally depends on the United States for its survival, are also in Brazil so much proclaimed tropical was Bolsonaro and the United States. But the rest of the countries reject this hostility of Washington against the Cuban Revolution, and this position has not changed in 60 years. As you all know, Cuba is going through difficult times with economic hardships, with the challenge of the COVID-19, with the policies of the U.S. administration that have not changed at all in 6 decades, despite what John Biden has promised in the election campaigns. Anyway, positive results have been seen with Soberana 2 and Abdala vaccines, and in months the whole population in Cuba might be vaccinated.
Agradecemos.
I would like to thank your statements, Dr. Kirk. And now we would like to give the floor to Member of Parliament Cristina Luna Morales, President of the Health Commission in the National Assembly in Cuba.
Permiso. Presidente.
Speaker Esteban Lasso and other participants and guests in this hearing, health sector have been priority of the Cuban government in different stages in these more than 60 years of revolution. However, despite all efforts we have implemented and all the resources we have used to support that priority and guarantee access, free of charge services and quality of services in recovery protection to all citizens, the impact of blockade in healthcare sector have been considerable and painful. Different actions implemented by the U.S. administration as part of the blockade, which has been strengthening total hatred towards the people of Cuba since 2019 up to March 2020, have posed significant losses in health sector that reach more than $188 million. This is an important figure to be considered since it's an illustration of what the blockade have meant for each Cuban citizen. And in these figures, we can see the suffering of a mother or a father, or a child, old people, or common citizens in this country, a Cuban citizen indeed. A Cuban citizen that wants to live and enjoy life, and in some occasions have been victims, some have been suffering, and have even died. Because the government, the administration of the United States has not enabled in many occasions the acquisition of reagents, medications, raw material, and fundamental materials for giving medical care, as has been expressed by the previous speakers on behalf of the Health Commission and Health and Sports Commission of the National Assembly, what represented only in the last year this genocidal and inhumane blockade of the United States towards Cuba. Examples are painful, and on day-by-day basis, those examples we have known in this link we have with the people, what our own families and relatives have been suffering from, and our neighbors as well have been victims. So what we Cuban all have been feeling, no one with common sense and human sensibility might be alien from so much pain that have been caused in a permanent basis, this blockade. Because of the U.S. blockade against Cuba, our country was not able to buy on time or had to access in faraway markets different materials which are fundamental for health sector. And some of the examples we can mention, but we have so much more of them, but we can mention, for instance, the pediatric lines that might be mentioned, the artery and veins, catheters for small kids, as well as pediatric dialysis bags used for newborns which kidneys acute diseases, as well as in the area of pediatric heart surgery. We have lackness of medications and devices for patients with very complex cardiovascular pathologies, which in many occasions create serious problems for kids as well as for all people. Extensible external prostheses for kids used in bone cancer patients to be able to avoid amputation of limbs, as well as nutritional supplements and food for medical use, which are essential in diet, in some nutritional conditions, mainly for kids. The treatment of breast cancer in metastases, which are sensitive to hormones, which today are suffer from many women, and also the lack of some other medications for kidneys, carcinoma, and lung cancer treatment. It is difficult as well to access standard drugs, equipment, and some other medical devices for the comprehensive treatment of oncological patients. The impossibility to buy some ventilators, which are so necessary during these times, as well as blood bags, which are not existent in our hospitals and places. We all know what is the meaning of not having blood for an operation, for a surgery. Also, we have the presence of the absence of raw material to produce some drugs like dipiron, diblenclamine, as well as others, which are so necessary for those who have some kind of condition, medical condition. And just mentioning some of these examples, but we have many of these examples of medications which are in scarcity, affected and caused by the blockade. We have a prohibition to transfer donations by solidarity organizations to support at this specific moment the campaigns to face COVID-19 pandemics. We have serious limitations to purchase supplies and necessary equipment for digestive and thoracic surgery. There are no possibilities to guarantee the sustainability of technologies and medical equipment which are used in the national health system. And it's also necessary to purchase those pieces, those spare parts in different markets which are far from our country, and this increases the prices of import, and sometimes it's impossible to purchase the necessary quantities to cover the demands for our patients. The sanitary transportation is also impacted because of the spare part lackness, and this has an impact and limits the life of patients and relatives in remote areas in our country. Because of the blockade of the United States, which was so abusive and cruel, we have problems in the functioning of clinical labs, in the primary attention of care attention, even in the tertiary health attention level. Sometimes there are delays in making some diagnostics because the same person have to go 5 times to have the same checkups, and people know about that. We go to pharmacies to purchase some drugs which are guaranteed to patients who have some chronic diseases, and most of the time these people have to go home without the medications, without the drugs, because they are not in the market at that specific time due to the blockade. This pandemic has affected human beings in the world, this COVID-19. Our government had to find specific and new solutions to assure that the health system might give attention and care to the people who are sick from this pandemic, with a comprehensive plan that includes the participation of different entities of the central administration of the state that supports the campaign to face this pandemic. The National Assembly, being coherent with the representation of the interests of the country, we denounce all the negative impact of the people of that the blockade have in the people of Cuba, mainly in health sector, which was one of the priorities in the plans of the revolution since the times of the attack to the Moncada garrison, and is also seen in Article 72 of the Constitution. We ratify the respect and admiration towards workers, students, scientists, and leaders that have been doing the Cuban miracle of keeping alive the health system in a year in which the impact of the blockade have been more genocidal in all sectors of society, but particularly in health sector. We reiterate likewise the respect and admiration for health sector workers which render their services anywhere in the world, giving life to human beings, all this in times in which the government, the administration of the United States have been developing a crusade to take credits away and to hurdle the international medical cooperation. We also consider that at present times in which humanity is facing a social and economic crisis during pandemic times, which dimensions are not able to be forecasted, it's necessary more than before that the international community demands the lifting of the embargo, the blockade, which is a measure of coercive unilateral system which is so complicated and has taken a long time imposed against any country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, MP. Your words are an expression of a painful testimony and a strong condemnation with which we feel identified. Now we'll listen to the message by the chairman of the International Relations Commission of the Vietnam's National Assembly. MPs of the Cuban National Assembly, friends all, receive our greetings of solidarity. And we congratulate our comrades of the International Relations Commission of the National Assembly, and I thank them for this opportunity to convey this message. Comrades, the party, the state, and the people of Vietnam are really pleased for the excellent relations of brotherhood between Vietnam and Cuba. As the Ho Chi Minh president said, Vietnam and Cuba are miles and miles away, but they are brothers and sisters from a same family. We will always recall solidarity and strong support to Cuba in its struggle and national unification. As Fidel Castro said, for Vietnam, we are willing to give our own blood. We grant special importance to the relations between Vietnam and Cuba during these 60 years that have been led by Ho Chi Minh and Fidel Castro. The peoples of Vietnam and Cuba joined together the historic struggle for national independence and to defend the right to self-determination and territorial integrity, and for the construction of socialism in the country. The Vietnam's National Assembly ratifies to be shoulder by shoulder with Cuba and coordinate with the Cuban National Assembly to continue advancing these special relations and strong solidarity between both countries in a deep and sustainable way, especially undertaking to push forward our economic relations to the same level as political relations and the potentialities of both countries in the benefit of the development of both countries and for world peace and the development of both regions. This time, once again, we ratify the consistent solidarity of the party, state, National Assembly, and people of Vietnam to the just cause of the broader party, state, and people of Cuba. We reject the policy of the blockade and hostility against Cuba. The people of Vietnam will continue be there for the Cuban people during the updating of the economic and social system of Cuba, so that Cuba is a democratic and prosperous. We Vietnamese will continue passing on to the next generations the excellent and traditional relations so that they are deepened and closer. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Brother Hey Ha. We emphasize that relations uniting Cuba and the heroic Vietnam were forged in the heroic struggle of our peoples and are long-standing. Now we're going to read the call of the International Relations Committee to all the parliaments of the world. And then I give the floor to the Secretary of this Commission, Alberto Núñez Betancourt. Greetings to the Presidency. The International Relations Committee of the National People's Power Assembly of the Republic of Cuba thanks all parliaments, parliamentary groups, organizations, entities, and persons from all corners of the world who have raised their voice in the last months in favor of the lifting of the economic, commercial, and financial blockade of the United States against Cuba. And it expresses its appreciation for the annual support of practically all governments in the world to the claim of the United Nations General Assembly for putting an end to this cruel and illegitimate policy. The blockade is the most comprehensive, unequal, and protracted war ever launched against any nation. It violates international law and the purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. It is a morally untenable policy and qualifies as an act of genocide. It counters the well-being, social stability, and satisfaction of the most basic needs of the Cuban people. It poses significant obstacles to the fulfillment of the country's development potential and deprives the nation from considerable financial and material resources needed for the day-to-day management of domestic economy, the provision of essential services, and the country's overall vitality. The International Relations Committee strongly condemns the economic blockade and in so doing recalls that the United States government escalated its aggressions against Cuba in the context of COVID-19 pandemic by applying additional coercive economic measures in combination with the punitive actions resulting from Cuba's re-inclusion in the State Department's spurious and arbitrary list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism. These actions continue posing exceptional obstacles to the accomplishment of the hard task of fighting the pandemic and saving lives, and they reveal this policy's extreme cruelty towards the Cuban people. Cuban members of parliament also reaffirmed their appeal to all legislators in the world, asking them to support the demand that the United States should repeal the infamous Helms-Burton Act, which was conceived to perpetuate the U.S. government's hostility against Cuba, impose a colonial tutelage mechanism on the Cuban nation, and punish, threaten, and intimidate the persons, organizations, and governments from third countries who sovereignly exercise their right to have relations with Cuba and freely develop their economic and commercial links with Cuba. We reiterate our call for the U.S. Congress to pay heed the voice of broad sectors of U.S. society who are in favor of the lifting of the blockade and to take the necessary steps to put an end to this stagnant policy against Cuba. We urge the U.S. legislature to establish communication channels with Cuba that may favor exchange and collaboration in areas of mutual bilateral interest. The International Relations Committee also reaffirms beyond any doubt the Cuban people's unbending determination to resist and overcome. Down the blockade. Long live Cuba. Cuba lives.
Muchas gracias, diputado. Para concluir esta...
To conclude this hearing, I invite to songwriter and singer Eduardo Souza, who will sing Jose Marti's words in a song. Good morning, all. Thank you for this invitation. It's an honor for me to be here.
Vierte, corazón, tu pena, donde no se llegue a ver, por soberbia y por no ser motivo de pena ajena. Yo te quiero ver su amigo, porque cuando siento el pecho ya muy cargado y deshecho, parto la carga en calma, amar y hacer bien conscientes, en enturbiar tus corrientes, con cuanto me agobie el alma, mi vida así se encamina al cielo limpia y serena, y tú me cargas mi pena con tu paciencia divina. Verso nos hablan de un Dios, ¿a dónde van los difuntos? Hay verso o nos condenan juntos o nos salvamos los dos. Leirala, leirerarara, ilara, leirerarara, ilare, ilare, ira. Verso nos hablan de un Dios, ¿a dónde van los difuntos? Hay verso o nos condenan juntos o nos salvamos los dos, o nos salvamos los dos.
Esta audiencia ha expresado fuertemente por defender su independencia y su soberanía.
Cuba will continue to defend its independence and sovereignty. I invite you all to adjourn before adjourning this session to listen to Silvia Rodriguez's author, music, The Little Daytime Serenade. So please do not leave me alone singing this song. I would like you to join me.
¿Cuál solamente puede ser libre en esta tierra y en ese instante? Y soy feliz porque soy gigante. Amo a una mujer clara que amo y me ama sin pedir nada o casi nada, que no es lo mismo, pero es igual. Y si esto fuera poco, tengo mis cantos que poco a poco muelo y rehago habitando el tiempo, como le cuadra a un hombre despierto. Soy feliz, soy un hombre feliz y quiero que me perdonen por este día los muertos de mi felicidad. Vivo en un país y soy feliz. Amo a una mujer clara que amo y me ama sin pedir nada o casi nada, que no es lo mismo, pero es igual. Y si esto fuera poco, tengo mis cantos que poco a poco muelo y rehago habitando el tiempo, como le cuadra a un hombre despierto. Soy feliz, soy un hombre feliz y quiero que me por este día los muertos de mi felicidad. Soy feliz, soy un hombre feliz y quiero que me perdonen por este día los muertos de mi felicidad. Abajo el bloqueo.
Down with the blockade, down with the blockade.